All right, hello. Today I'm going to be talking about this sine curve here that I have written here, y equal 5 sine 2x minus 1. And the 5 that's a coefficient of sine here is going to be the amplitude or the vertical dilation of the sine curve. And then this 2 is going to affect the period. So the period of the sine curve is 2 pi, and I'm going to take this 2 and divide it into the period of the sine curve. So 2 pi divided by 2, my new period is going to be pi. And then this minus 1 here, subtract 1, this is going to be my midline or vertical shift. So this is where I'm going to start with sketching this graph. So at y equal negative 1, then I am going to draw a horizontal line there. So I go over here and get my tool, and I'm going to make that red. So at negative 1, let's see here, you go through negative 1, so all the way across here. This is y equal negative 1. And then I'm going to use this amplitude to do the next feature of the graph, which is the amplitude. So from negative 1, I'm going to go up 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So at y equal 4, I'm going to draw another horizontal line there. And then down 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at y equal negative 6 is going to be my other horizontal line. So this first dashed horizontal line drew is going to be my midline, and then these other two horizontal lines are going to define my amplitude. So my amplitude goes from the midline to the maximum, and then midline to the minimum. So if I were to plot some points here, so I'm going to get the pen and let's go ahead and make the graph in blue here. So let's select blue in the pen. So for the sine curve, I'm going to start on the midline. And since there's no phase shift in this equation, we'll talk about that at some other point. But since there's no phase shift, then I'm going to start on my midline. And then my period is pi. So this right here is pi. And I'm also going to put plot a point there. And so this would be pi over 2 right here. And each of these tick marks here would be a value of pi over 4. So the scale on my x-axis, the way I have it drawn here, is pi over 4. So I start on the center line, and then I went to my period, and I plotted on the midline again. And then halfway between those two at pi over 2, I'm going to be on the midline again. And then halfway between these 2 points on the sine curve is going to be a maximum. So at pi over 4, I have a maximum. And then at 3 pi over 4, I'm going to have a minimum. And then the sine curve is symmetrical about the origin. So I'm going to do a similar thing on the other side here. So at negative pi over 2, I'm on the center line again, and at negative pi on the center line. And then halfway between these 2 points, I have a minimum. And then halfway between negative pi over 2 and negative pi, I'm going to have a maximum. So this would be enough points here to define my curve. So if I sketch a graph through there, and it's a little bit hard to do with the mouse, but go ahead and try the best we can. The mouse to sketch the sine curve here. All right, so that's the sine curve. So to summarize what's going on here and to graph things. So to summarize, whatever the coefficient of this, we can do the same idea with the cosine curve. We just have a different starting point. We'd start at a maximum for the positive cosine curve. We'd start at max and end at a max of the period. But we'll also discuss that at some other point. So you get the same idea. The numbers are going to affect the sine or cosine curve in the same way. So the number in front of the sine or cosine is going to affect the amplitude, and then the coefficient, whether it's of x or something in parentheses with x, that's going to affect the period. And you're always going to take 2 pi divided by, we often call this our b value here. So we're going to divide that into 2 pi, and we get our period, which is pi, and then our midline once again was at y equal -1. So I probably should actually label those. I'm going to go over and label these here. So this is at, so I went from -1 and added 5. So this is y equal 4 here. So this is y equal 4. My midline was at y equal -1. And my minimum line was at y equal -6. All right, so if I labeled those things, and then labeling my x scale here, this is my period pi, so I decided to make this pi, and then halfway between is pi over 2. So each of these are pi over 4. The other way, this would be negative pi on the negative side of the x-axis. This would be -5 pi. This would be negative pi over 2. And to once again review how we made the sine curve, we always start on the center line. Whether it's if there's a phase shift, then we'll start on the center line at the phase shift. But there's no phase shift here, so we start at the center line. So at the origin, I plotted 0, -1, and then I went to my period and plotted a point there, halfway between on the midline again, and then halfway between these first 2 points, I'm going to have a maximum, and then halfway between pi over 2 and pi, I have a minimum. And then on the negative side, this is a symmetrical about the origin, then this would be a minimum here and a maximum, and I'm still going to be on the center line at negative pi over 2 and negative pi. It'll just go down and up. And that would also, if there was a negative in front of it here, that would make a reflection over the x-axis. So I would go to a minimum and then a maximum if this number happened to be negative. But everything else would remain the same. I would still plot on the center line for, or the midline for the sine curve. So that's it for this equation. We'll also talk about the cosine curve and phase shift. So those 2 things were not included in here of how to plot the cosine curve and what to do if we had a phase shift here with x. So if we had something in parentheses at x plus or minus something, that would cause this graph to shift horizontally. All right, thanks for watching.